I'm going to have to
That's
interrupt you.
so that's okay. Yeah, no worries.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing.
Yeah,
You've got a wealth of experience. And I noticed that you had put in your contact, your LinkedIn profile. So I'm going to encourage people that are on the
yeah,
call to put in your contact information because this is a network and it's really important to build those connections and learn off of the people who have a wealth of experience. I want to segue into our next session. So thank you, John and Ryland and Sarah, for that. And you guys are going to be the next presenters on the Indigenous Participation Plans. So Indigenous Participation Plans or impact benefit agreements may have different names. They're the method used to have Indigenous involvement in major projects or contracts that support community economic development. It provides subcontracting opportunities, skill development, or direct employment opportunities. And with Government of Canada's new 5% Indigenous participation targets in contracting, more communities will be faced with decisions about how to participate in these opportunities. So this next session is about introducing IPPs and considerations for communities. So we're going to have Sara Monture, Procurement Navigator of Cando, Ryland Brennan, Principal Consultant of Acosys, and John Johnstone, Associate Director of Procurement, Cando. Handing it over to you guys. Thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. And I mean, it's an amazing segue, and I know Barry can talk about this stuff for days. So I fully recommend that everyone make sure that you follow up with Barry, Sarah, Ryland, myself. It was interesting. Ethan had just put in a comment in the chat about the Yukon having a 15% Indigenous participation piece. And I know from a lot of the policy work I did supporting the federal government's initiatives, we looked very much at what the Yukon was doing as being a leader in this space. And I know Shirley mentioned it at the beginning as well, right? That there was these opportunities and what this could look like. And it's a great segue from the piece we just did about technical writing, because one of the things that we discussed was, well, what is your business strategy, or why are you trying to be there? What's happening? But I'm going to put forward a scenario. As an economic development officer working in a community already faced with many challenges. You're sitting in your office and an email comes into your inbox or the phone rings, and it is a prime contractor, not necessarily a level of government, but a prime contractor saying, I'm about to bid on this piece of work. There is a 5 to 15% Indigenous participation requirement within this process. Your community is specifically one of the communities that has an opportunity here. What do you want to do? And you're sitting there as an EDO in community, and you've never heard of this. You may not even know what an Indigenous participation plan is. You may not have any idea about what that opportunity is, even if there was proper consultation done on it. And now you're sitting there being like, oh my gosh, what do I do? And basically, for the next 45 minutes, we're going to try to answer some of those first, what do you do questions. We're not going to dive into an absolute look at this. And in fact, Cando is developing a full links to learning section that would be multiple hours to look at Indigenous participation plans. And another segue, we're also looking at one for joint ventures. So with this afternoon, we won't be able to answer all of your burning questions about JVs as well, but we're working towards that. So, but this is not whether you're the EDO or whether you're a business leader. Also, businesses would be contacted by those primes, because if the prime businesses have access to business lists, which they will, or through the community, there may be a very short opportunity to figure out how community-based businesses the community itself or non-community based businesses could participate in some of these opportunities. So what I'll do is I'll just introduce the topic, and then I'm going to hand it over to Ryland and Sarah. So we just put this slide in for everything to let you know Cando exists and that we're also here to support you. And even after this session, if you've got questions or you're trying to find someone who was presenting and you can't find Ryland or Sarah or Barry or anyone else, you can contact us through Cando and we'll make sure we get you the information, because this is the most important part of what we're doing, is connecting you to the work. Okay, on to the next piece. So what is an IPP, an Indigenous Participation Plan? And what I'll do is I'll just go through this slide first and then move through it. But it's really, when we're talking about Indigenous Participation Plan, that's the Government of Canada's wording that they're using to describe benefits that would go specifically to Indigenous communities or Indigenous businesses to increase participation, which is the whole purpose of why we're doing this work. It can basically look at a number of elements that will be talked about through this session, but the big thing is how do you respond as a community? How do you respond as a business when you're faced with these opportunities? And the number one thing I will say as we're going through this is you don't have to do anything in that moment. You need to gather your information. You need to seek feedback. You need to discover what the actual economic plan is for the community. And the reason I'm going to say that is this scenario is that someone comes forward with a construction project that is just on the edge of a traditional territory that looks valuable. And let's say the community's like, well, we haven't really seen this before. Let's go for it. It looks good. It looks like a great opportunity. And the community then decides, and the community businesses decide that they're going to invest their efforts in this project without thinking about, is it fully within the direction the community members want to go in. You decide to do it, you invest all your time and energy in this project, and 6 months later, another IPP shows up that was absolutely in your wheelhouse. It would have provided so much for the whole community, from youth to elders to businesses, but you've now invested all of your efforts in another project that may be of lower value. And the idea is to make sure that you take the time, even if people seem like they're rushing, to stop and make sure you're doing things that are in the best interest of your community, in best interest of your businesses, and the best interests of your future opportunities, for the whole process, which involves the community-based decision making, relationship building, not only necessarily with the prime contractors, but why you didn't hear this from government first, who are the government advocates that are looking in the space. And the idea here is we've kind of called it like triaging for first aid as it would relate to IPPs at this point, is saying, what are those key pieces that happen when your phone rings or that you get this opportunity? How much time do you have to actually make a proper assessment? And what are going to be some of the things you need to consider on the way through? So at this point, maybe Ryland, unless I've messed up, you can take a look at this to start, and then we can also bring in Sarah as well.
Yeah, I'll be passing it off to Sarah here, John, and then I'll be coming a little later, and Sarah and I will have some back and forth here.
Great,
Go
thank
ahead,
you.
Sarah.
All right, so by the time there's a procurement underway, the RFP with the outlining the IPP requirements is issued. It's a very short window to prepare. So rather than wait, be proactive. We suggest you be proactive, and community and businesses can prepare and anticipate by undertaking the Community Capability Assessment, or CCA, as we've shortened it down to, which helps you understand the requirements of the construction and defense industries. So as John mentioned, this really is an overview, sort of a teaser on IPPs, and we do promise to have a more fulsome session on the toolbox for another links to learning session. But step one for the CCA process is the IPP Community Capability Assessment. So it should be part of every community's economic development strategy. The CCA is a way for the community to understand its current business capacity and potential capability, the composition of the workforce, and other factors that you could take advantage of in an IPP-related opportunity. The second step is to understand the requirements. So identify the most promising opportunities for your community in the construction and defense industries to understand the typical and anticipated requirements of those industries. Step 3 moves into aligning the requirements to capacity, capability, and economic development plan. So, aligning the requirements of the federal procurement opportunities to community capacity, capability, and economic development plan. So really determine which goods or services, including your workforce, the community is best positioned to supply. And then that fourth step is to identify and pursue opportunities. John really touched on it best. Major projects don't just happen. Governments are well aware of what's coming years in advance. So by working with leadership to really start to develop that relationship, I've always suggested you build that bridge way before you need it, and you keep those avenues of communication open so that you are also well aware of major projects well in advance. And so that helps you steer businesses, labor to where those opportunities are going to be. So I'll pass it over to Ryland now.
Thank you, Sarah. Just highlighting this as well. We are, with the examples here today, focusing more on the construction IPPs and the defense sector IPPs, particularly when they come to the federal government. But one tip I will share too for EDOs on the line here as well is to get in lockstep with the consultation offices within your communities, whether that be for federal projects that are regulated through, the CER, or Canadian Energy Regulator, or through other NRCan processes, or even through provincial processes and permitting, because typically the consultation offices should have the most notice of what activities should be upcoming within your traditional territories, and you can identify who the proponents are, so who's going to be building the actual thing that they're applying to get the permits for, and develop a relationship or a line of sight early on as to what that strategy looks like. Diving in more back to Indigenous Participation Plans as a bit of an overview, they have their origins in the Procurement Strategy for Aboriginal Businesses, or the PSAB, which was created in 1996 with the overall goal of increasing the value of federal contracts secured by Indigenous businesses. In August of 2021, the program was actually renamed to the Procurement Strategy for Indigenous Businesses and mandated federal departments and agencies. There was a list of about 94 of them over a 3 to 4 year period where they were rolling it out. To ensure a minimum contract value of 5% was held by Indigenous businesses, recognizing that they wouldn't be able to achieve that 5% minimum through direct contracting. So that being governments to, the government of Canada purchasing directly from an Indigenous business. They basically decided to also institute IPPs so that they could start pushing more of their prime and general contractors to subcontract and develop Indigenous suppliers in that space and include them on their projects. One of the other things to note is that IPPs as a requirement, they're for sure a requirement in a lot of major projects we've seen. And while they've been very consistently coming out with IPPs on a variety of projects across Canada and for service-based delivery, so not just in construction or defense construction Canada projects, there is still a little bit of an ad hoc frequency on what we're seeing and when they come out, and also in terms of what the expectations are. So just something to be aware of on the line is that not all the IPPs you are going to be seeing coming from the federal government are going to be asking the same thing at all times. And some opportunities, depending on, and to Barry's point earlier about the people at PSPC are putting together the packages with the information that they know at the time, it may not be on their radar to include more robust IPPs or have an IPP on the opportunity. also another thing, and we've kind of heard a lot of different TLAs or three-letter acronyms kind of thrown out earlier today about IPPs, IBPs, IBAs, and ICPs. Just to make sure that we're assured that these are different things. You've got IPPs, or Indigenous Participation Plans. They are sometimes called Indigenous Benefit Plans or Indigenous Component Plans. These are different from, of course, Inuit participation plans as well that come through the Nunavut Agreement in 1999 there. All of these things, though, IPPs, IBPs, and ICPs, are also different from IBAs, or impact benefit agreements. Some impact benefit agreements, as was highlighted earlier, may have IPP requirements for when a sourcing activity does occur, as mandated in those IBAs, or impact benefit agreements. But an IPP itself does not replace or is not the same thing as an IBA. So as I talked about earlier with the PSIB, the IPPs came out of that policy requirement, not only to apply to major procurements of goods and services by the Government of Canada, but also for encouraging businesses to engage and co-develop with Indigenous contractors. Ultimately, IPPs, while they do form part of the contractual obligation between the business and the prime or general contractor they're working under, ultimately the IPPs are submitted to government for approval, and the government should be working with the prime contractors and the Indigenous businesses to monitor and ensure that the implementation goes smoothly. John, I see you've gone off mute. Is there any point that you want to
Yeah,
touch
I
on
just
right now?
I'll give everyone a chance to untangle their brains around all of the letters that Ryland has just discussed. And I just recognized in our setup of this is that for the folks on the line that this is a really, really new topic for is I just want to reverse gears here for a second and say, okay, well, what is this thing? Like, so with an Indigenous participation plan, basically it's a contractual requirement in especially the government of Canada is using, but we're seeing it, like, again, talking about the Yukon and others, where basically it's saying there has to be an effort made to increase the amount of Indigenous participation or content in a supply chain around a major project, right? I think that's the big thing, is to say, so how do we do that? So you could either have an Indigenous company win as a prime contractor, that's like 100%, and that is incredible. You could have a situation where that prime contractor directly hires Indigenous people to work in their company, and that could be seen as a benefit because it's direct employment. There's also the opportunity, and this is where it really comes into play, is around subcontracting. So one of the elements here to look at is where prime contractors have a really particular way they typically do business and already have formed all of their supply chains. They know who they typically do business with. But the government of Canada, let's say in this circumstance, is now going and saying to those companies, you have to adjust your supply chain to actually include more Indigenous businesses in order to get the points you need in the procurement process to win this contract. So what happens is that company obviously wants to win this contract, win the opportunity. So what they then do is they have to readjust, but it's done very quickly, as we talked about, with very little time and effort, and often they're freaking out to try to figure out how to do this the first couple of times, and that creates a bit of a rush. The other way that this can actually happen is by direct benefits to the community around skill development and training, so that in some circumstances they could actually be putting on training courses to hire people or to invest almost in those Indigenous companies to make sure that skills are developing that enhance the supply chain. So these are the elements that are considered the Indigenous participation plan, that prime contractor has to do a technical writing exercise of writing all this stuff out, filling out these forms, and submitting this as part of their bid. And then once they win the bid, is that they then have to see all of these requirements through as part of the contract to do the work. So I wanted to stop there because I recognized for some reason I had not had a slide in the first part that gave that definition. And before we lose too many people around the acronyms, I really wanted to make sure that I brought it back, gave you the 101 on what this is, and now it'll be hopefully clearer as we move forward to make sure that's there.
And John, there is a question in the chat that I'm hoping you guys will be able to address during your presentation. It's around municipalities
Yep.
and whether they have to have IPPs.
Ryland, you
Yeah.
want to take that on now?
Absolutely. So I think I did respond in the chat already to Sandra McLeod. Great question. It was, do municipalities have to produce their IPP? So some municipal governments have their own procurement policies in place that do require IPPs or mandated Indigenous spend. A great example of municipality that's leading the way in this right now is the city of Regina. That has a mandatory IPP requirement as well as an Indigenous spend requirement for a lot of their procurement activities. However, unfortunately, no, and I see that is it Alantony, our fantastic host today, has stated that municipalities do not have IPPs in the Yukon. However, the territorial procurement policy as a benchmark and incentive to get territorial funding. I do also believe that Ethan highlighted the 15% policy that exists as well for Indigenous businesses. So again, not all municipalities are there yet. You see some municipalities across Canada kind of taking the initiative. What I will say is that typically you'll see it in large urban centers that have very active Indigenous communities in the surrounding area. I'm not sure if it's been formalized yet, but I know that the municipality of Toronto was working on one or renewing their existing one. I'm not sure, Sarah, if you are aware of any of that work that's going on in the GTA there. I also know that the city of Halifax, when they hosted the Indigenous Games last year, made an announcement that they would be updating their Indigenous policy as well. So hopefully that answers the question.
Primarily in the GTA, they talk about community benefits agreements. And there is an Indigenous component to that.
Fantastic. Well, and thank you very much, John, for coming and bringing it back to, a very basic level and again, ensuring that we're all on the same page here, because yeah, there's a lot of acronyms and it can get very complicated very quickly. Some of what John has said too, we'll be touching on again in later slides here. But basically, what the big takeaway here from all the acronyms are is that there are different plans for different situations, and we're particularly going to be highlighting the difference between IPPs, IBPs, and ICPs and IBAs. The rationale for why they're going to be included on federal procurement plans or influencing federal procurement. If it's an IBA, it's going to be policy or legislatively driven, especially if it's north of 60. The rationale for including an IPP or an IBP or an ICP is it's basically policy driven in the case of the Government of Canada. So that's going back to PSIB. You may also have IPPs, it's unrelated to Section 35 rights. If the project involves construction, those rights are going to be addressed through a socioeconomic assessment phase and have required, approvals before construction actually starts. Typically as well, before they award a prime contractor, typically the proponent will have the actual contract in place. Whereas IBAs are oftentimes intended to address potential adverse impact on Section 3 rights through mitigation and or accommodation. Another difference is that on the engagement and consultation front for IPPs, potential suppliers engage communities and businesses during the bid development phase and often post RFP issue. So again, in the example where you've got a private industry going in there building a project, they will be engaging the community already to get their permits in place. They may release the bid early to ensure that prime contractors have time to develop relationships with communities and to inform the RFP. But there may also be some tweaking post-award after the RFP stage to basically finalize the IPPs. Whereas on the IBA side of things, typically the Crown, the Crown always must exercise its duty to consult from the very beginning to the end of the regulatory process. Project proponents during the course of that duty to consult consultation can negotiate the agreements with communities during the regulatory process to secure either social license, or to help support a positive decision from the regulator in their favor. And that's often where you see IBAs come in. With research and writing, this is where you'll typically have an IPP just to ensure that you've got Indigenous engagement or Indigenous support for doing and supporting that type of work. Whereas typically for an IBA, if there's an IBA in place, it's very prescriptive that if there's any research or writing going on in this area, it's going to be co-developed by the community and the proponent. The community is going to be specifically mentioned, and it's going to be mandated that they be involved. Whereas if you've got a research and writing component on an IPP or an IBP or an ICP, likely there may not be a prescribed community that must be involved, and co-development is likely something that is going to be a nice to have as opposed to a must have. When it comes to the content as well, the strategies and the approaches that IPPs and IBAs tend to take are different because they serve different means, right? So the IBA is going to be looking at measures to address potential adverse environmental impacts, monitoring and accommodation, very specific in terms of what they're going to be able to offer, or the proponent will offer in terms of training and approaches to employment and contracting, and other measures to support community projects or programs. Also, they typically include agreements surrounding monitoring, governance, reporting, and just things like first right of refusal for contracting opportunities. Whereas IPPs are really more focused on, just the life cycle of the activity of the project, and strategies that are focused on really just driving that subcontracting piece, committing to some training, but having mitigations. If that training doesn't work, then we'll try and find other measures to increase the amount of subcontracting to ensure that we hit our Indigenous spend commitments or Indigenous participation commitments. Typically, IPPs or good IPPs will always include an agreement between the Indigenous businesses that are a part of them and the prime or general contractor to ensure that they're monitoring and reporting in a transparent manner. So that way, what's being shared to the government of Canada when they're doing their IPP reporting is in line of sight of the Indigenous business to verify. When you look at ownership and control as well, the documents for IPPs are typically co-owned by the prime supplier and government, whereas IBAs are typically a document that's owned between the community and the proponent that they entered into the agreement with. I'm going to pass things over to Sara here to talk briefly about some of the great support that is also out there. And we actually have a few special guests from them on the line today. And you've already seen the great value that they can bring to a conversation. So Sara, please go right ahead.
So the Government of Canada procurement refers to all goods, services, and construction services purchased by the government. The Government of Canada purchases over 30 billion in goods and services annually. So you can see that it's a tremendous opportunity. Public Services and Procurement Canada, PSPC, more acronyms for you, supports federal departments and agencies in their daily operations as their central purchasing agent, real property manager, treasurer, accountant, pay and pension administrator, integrity advisor, common service provider, and linguistic authority. Procurement Assistance Canada, or PAC, who we are very fortunate to have some representatives here today. While departments may leverage PSPC to issue and manage sourcing events for goods and services, a specific part of PSPC called Procurement Assistance Canada is a responsive and support-oriented resource for answering general questions. You can see how responsive they are. Look at how quick Barry is firing into that chat. Answer general questions regarding federal procurement opportunities, processes, and systems on a non-opportunity driven timeline. So again, thank you to our PAC representatives for attending and participating. We appreciate all of your support.
Maybe a quick shout out to Sarah Lacey, who is located in Yellowknife or adjacent to Yellowknife, as well as a local rep for folks in the north as well. What you may find though is that if you're in the Yukon, you're going to be dealing with our with PAC's team out of Vancouver and Victoria, and if you're in Northwest Territories or none of it, you'll be working more directly with Sarah Lacey as well. So just a quick shout out and let you know that there'll be different people depending upon your location.
Absolutely, and you know, I can speak firsthand. You know, I work for an Indigenous-owned business, and reaching out to PAC has been a really helpful thing for our business to do over the years to help grow. And I've had the pleasure of meeting both Barry and Sarah Lacey, and I encourage everyone here. Again, part of this is about networking. Add them to your list of contacts because they're both fantastic resources and people that when you bring questions forward, if they don't know the answer, they're more than likely to be able to know someone at the Government of Canada who can probably point you in the right direction. I just want to again go back to the chat. Again, Sandra McLeod asked a good question about the provincial requirements to have IPPs that John responded to, saying it's on a case-by-case basis. Again, each province or territory will have or is in the process of developing their own strategy. So again, today we kind of focused on contracting employment opportunities in construction with a bit of an overlap in the defense sector and building out these kind of introductory materials. It's very intentional as the defense sector also has a component to it called ITBs, or industrial technical benefits, that basically provide respondents, so the proponents writing in the proposals, additional scoring points if they do creative and innovative things in different categories that increase investment in Canadian training, education, or manufacturing in different contexts. So just so you're aware as to why we're focusing in particular on contracting and construction, as Barry pointed out, there are over 170 departments that he's aware of. So it's, you know, focused on construction and employment opportunities and contract opportunities there today, but there are definitely other things. So one of the big things here is that the construction industry employs over 1.6 million Canadians and contributes $151 billion annually to the economy. And many of the federal government led projects will consider having IPPs. In fact, I've been supporting a number of different respondents to federal government construction IPPs. And I will say that actually in the last year, I haven't seen any gone out that don't have an IPP requirement. So definitely trending the right way there. PSPC and DCC, so Public Service and Procurement Canada and Defense Construction Canada, those are the two acronyms there. They're the ones primarily responsible for the sourcing events on the infrastructure construction directly, including the developing of the IPPs for sourcing events. Why we focused on this as well is that while we're missing data from the northern industry, if we look at the amount of Indigenous peoples in Canada overall at about 5%, and you look at the Indigenous construction workers percentages across Canada, it's actually higher than the national average is actually higher than the Indigenous population, with spikes in Saskatchewan and Manitoba of around 16% of the Indigenous population involved in the construction field. So that's why we chose to focus on these ones today. One of the big things for Indigenous participation plans in the construction industry is that they typically are a good entry point to focus on because they have very clear articulated expectations on contracting, employment, and training. We need this material delivered to this job site by this date, or we need to ensure that we have this service provided to ensure that this building is ready for construction or is ready for in service by this date. Employment is well understood, and there's a strong amount of existing Indigenous capacity as reflected in the numbers. But also, there are plenty of opportunities, or there's an easing of opportunities on the training side of things, because there's already typically established mentors in place and successful programs in place that can lead to an easier transition in working in these areas. One of the things that you'll typically start seeing as well as a part of the IPPs in the construction industry is that it's moving beyond, though, the general and skilled labor and moving into white collar job expectations as well. So things like project management, things like scheduling, things like HR, things like payroll. You're now seeing opportunities where they're asking for not only articulations of what the number of Indigenous people are expected to be employed or trained, but what are they going to be employed doing on the project as a part of the IPP, and what are there going to be in terms of training opportunities for advancement should Indigenous peoples be interested in pursuing those opportunities as they relate to the project. Moving over into the defense sector side of things, the defense sector employs over 78,000 Canadians and contributes 9.2 billion to the economy annually. You've got Public Service and Procurement Canada, the Department of National Defense, and ISED, or Innovation, Science and Economic Development Canada, if I'm not mistaken. I see some nodding from the Government of Canada employees. Fantastic. Didn't forget it. And they're primarily responsible for the defense procurement events that can take place over several years to complete. Again, between the complexity of these defense contracts, as well as just the timelines for when they need to implement a lot of the requirements, particularly around things like security clearance and access to secured sites, means that the sourcing events too for the higher dollar values may be phased or tiered over a number of years. When it comes to Indigenous participation in the defense industry, one of the big and interesting overlaps is that Indigenous communities are near actually 80% of the Canadian Armed Forces dispositions and defense industry activities in Canada. There's a lack of data right now to give the percentage of Indigenous workforce in defense. And while historic involvement from business we know is low, just anecdotally from conversations we've had with EDOs across Canada, there's a promising upward trend of Indigenous businesses getting more involved in the defense industry. Additional incentives, and this is what I highlighted earlier on with the ITVs, or industrial technical benefits, is that there are additional incentives as well for defense contractors, distinct from the IPPs, that have been introduced to help further support Canadian content in defense opportunities, including Indigenous groups, businesses, and peoples. Particularly, the ITVs award different points or additional points for things like the development of a business, or development of manufacturing capacity, or development of skilled workforce and training. And because a lot of programs in proximity to, or a lot of programs already exist in Indigenous communities, think of your ISET holders, think of your Indigenous-led learning that occurs on reserves, because those institutions and those organizations are on reserve, and the proximity to CAF bases is 80%, there's a natural synergy opportunity that we're seeing in the defense sector, where they're realizing that, well, communities, from an employment perspective, we don't have to have people relocate or apply to these jobs. We can have someone live in community and commute to base for when we need work to happen, or when we need to have different personnel trained or be able to support this project, we can actually go to these organizations that are already in place and that are already successful and know how to train people, and just give them more content or help support them to develop content to be able to train currently a potentially underutilized workforce. And the prime contractors putting these plans together will get rewarded for it by the federal government in terms of how they're scoring their proposals that they're putting forward. So we're still in the early days of seeing how this is going to play out, but there are a few examples across Canada that we're starting to see an early trend or indication of the defense sector working better with Indigenous communities than they have in the past.
Ryland,
Go right ahead.
Ryland, I'm gonna jump in here for a
Please.
sec. I'm gonna provide a bit of a real scenario here in the context of everything that Ryland just talked about. Is that I'm gonna put a couple of extra links in the feed in a second here, but the government of Canada released a defense policy in April 2024. And I mean, this is the Northern Links to Learning. And one of the things that we saw absolutely abundantly in this new defense policy was a focus on the North. And what we're now seeing is how the government of Canada is going to action that policy. And so for me anyways, you folks may be able to tell me otherwise, but I saw one of the first RFPs come out related to this defense strategy recently. It's open right now, so our friends at PSPC can't comment on it, but I am going to put it into the feed for people to look at, because it is about a request for an over-the-horizon radar system, which would be part of basically the NORAD system, the Northern Early Warning System. And there's a 15% Indigenous participation plan at this point within those documents. But that is an example, and with this type of situation, I'm making some assumptions here, so you don't have to hold me to everything I'm about to say. But this system would be something that would not just be isolated to one geographic location. This would be a system that would have to be maintained across all three territories in one way, shape, or form. And this strategy that the defense strategy is looking at is going to look at the full North. So it is going to potentially have impacts for lots of businesses, for lots of communities to potentially be involved. And I know at Cando, we are actively watching the rollout of the strategy and figuring out how best we can support communities in the North to make sure they have the education, understanding, and tools they need to actively make decisions about how they may want to participate in this type of opportunity. We're also seeing things with Parks Canada. We're also seeing things with Natural Resources Canada. We're seeing things with emergency preparedness around climate change and, what happened in the North around wildfires in the last couple of years. There is numerous projects going on that could benefit communities in the North by participating actively in some of these procurements. But one of the things we definitely know, given the size of the investment that Canada is considering in defense, with a focus on the North, that this is an area we certainly want to make sure that Indigenous communities, EDOs, and businesses are aware of and that are positioned to make the right decisions for their organizations or communities to maximize their participation wherever they see fit. So one of the first things that would happen around that is being able to understand and assess your community capacity assessment, your community capacity and how you want to participate. So back over to Ryland, and I'll put those things in the chat.
Thank you so much, John. And yeah, it's a really interesting opportunity for those of you who are interested to take a look at it, and maybe implement some of the technical writing tips and tricks that John highlighted. Use that Control F feature to find some of the must-haves and take a look. So going back to here.
And I'm
Oh,
just
go
highlighting
ahead.
as well. So we are at the lunch break, but I'm just highlighting that. Thanks.
For sure. So as John and Sarah had articulated earlier on here, doing those community readiness and opportunity pursuits or the capacity assessments should be a part of every community's economic development strategy. I'm just going to do a quick overview of what that looks like in practical terms here. You're basically going to be wanting to focusing on these 4 core areas of capacity within your community. You're going to be looking at your administrative capacity, especially because, when these opportunities come, there may be more than one proponent that's going to be reaching out to you for information, and they may be looking for meetings with everyone from someone that could talk to them about education and training, to someone that could talk to them about rallying and posting jobs or collecting resumes, to wanting to meet with chief and council to have MOUs signed. So understanding your administrative capacity and how to handle requests from external businesses is an important thing to have understood. Businesses, what are the nation-owned businesses? What are the member-owned businesses? What are their core services? You don't need to necessarily have a nuanced understanding of everything, but for nation-owned businesses, an equipment list that includes whatever attachments the equipment might have, as well as what the rates are for operators or rental. That should be something you have at the ready, especially because sometimes when there's, let's say, a weather event that delays construction, they're going to be desperate to try and recapture lost days so that they can hit deliverable for in-service. So having that type of information at the ready is really important. You want to have labor force information. So what current people in the community are potentially looking for job opportunities? Who do you have in the community that already has a skilled trade, or is maybe interested in switching careers, because there might be also opportunities um, for cross training or training for new opportunities, and then resources. So what does your community have in terms of capacity for power generation? What does your community have in terms of maybe it's a crush, maybe it's aggregate, all these different things you'll list out, and that kind of creates a good baseline. Here's an example right here, just looking at the different asset categories. So under economic assets, if we look at energy, or sorry, under economic assets, if we look under infrastructure, we can see that energy production and distribution, there may be times where power to site is going to be limited. And so if you have access to power and they're able to bring over batteries for charging, that's something to do. Or if, let's say, when it comes to energy production, you have diesel storage because you have diesel power in your community. Well, they may be using diesel generators on site. And if it saves them the ability to go and procure diesel from somewhere else, and it's something you can provide, then that's an asset for you. As well as different land and geography assets. Do you have industrial land zoned or vacant land? Is there a common land that's band owned that could potentially be leveraged for something like a temporary a temporary site for holding materials, because the business might have long lead times for certain things that have been ordered and they need a holding yard prior to getting their actual permits to be able to store equipment or to store materials on site before they receive those approvals. What do you have in terms of existing business activities, both on and off reserve, that could work on the project? If it's an opportunity where there is, potential for ownership or investment, what is the current state or access to capital or revenue and debt? Is this opportunity a slam dunk? You're guaranteed to be written in and have opportunities, and you're looking to maximize it. Is it possible that you could potentially finance equipment once, of course, the contract is signed and you've already been given the award, to ensure that you're able to maximize your return on investment and really get the most out of the opportunity that's there? You also want to look at the social assets that are there. You want to make sure that the project that you're going to be supporting and have the baseline information that you need to understand what the governance priorities are for the community, what the current relationship is like with the school, and if there'd be any interest in having private industry come in, or representatives from the project come in to explain what the opportunity is to students, and if that's something that leadership would be open and interested in. Understanding what the current state of housing is. Oftentimes too, when you have projects, there may be additional materials available after construction, and I've oftentimes seen on major infrastructure projects, when certain materials are no longer needed, or there's an over order, or there's a change to the scope of work based on something no longer being in need, you have materials left on site that the prime contractor is also ultimately responsible for ensuring are removed prior to in service date. So having an understanding of what might be a community opportunity to have 16 extra sheets of plywood that are no longer needed at a building site construction, and where they could be repurposed efficiently, ensures that if that opportunity does come up, you're ready to receive it. The other asset categories here, and I see John's gone off mute, but I'm just going to hold you at bay for one more moment, John, as we run through some of the more nuanced questions here. And this whole presentation list here that you see embedded here is actually from the IPP toolbox that the Cando has developed. So all of these different categories here you see listed, how they're broken down. Each one of these economic assets, where we go through infrastructure and what those different things are, has correlating questions associated with it. So that way you're able to go in and not do this all from scratch, but it literally walks you question by question to ensure that you have the right information, so that if and when a proponent does reach out to see how your community can best fit in their IPP, you have all this information at your fingertips. And a reminder to something that John said earlier as well, is that when someone does reach out to you asking for your information to participate in an IPP, it's okay to say no. Give me a minute, go and collect the information you need before committing to anything or responding. John, please go right ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for that, Ryland, and that, we will be sharing this presentation. I know we have the joint venture toolbox, which will be a product we'll be fully releasing. We're kind of test driving parts of it even here today as a bit of a focus group setup. And I just wanted to make sure that we checked in with Sara Monture and gave her the last word on this section before we get people out for a bit of a break.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to stand in the way between between us and lunch. So, no, again, this is meant to be a teaser. We will have a more fulsome presentation at a later date, and we really will have time to really do a deep dive into IPPs.
Fantastic. Well, I'll just skip ahead here to Sarah's closeout here. What we've got here as well for just everyone's interest is that IPPs are basically economic opportunity vehicles for your community. So when you have the baseline done, and it doesn't need to be a robust or deep dive on the community capacity assessment yet, but one of the biggest things that you could do for your community is start by just making a simple list. And Sarah, I'm going to pass this over to you to walk through what that procurement opportunity checklist looks like, and to dive into the Cando toolbox here when you have the time, and start building it out piece by piece, section by section. And once you have it to a point where it's really robust, don't hesitate to reach out to your professional network to say, hey, can you give me a second opinion on this? Am I interpreting this accurately? Because again, that's what the network here is for, is to ensure that you've got that that second set of eyes, or that guidance to help ensure that you're in the best position possible to take advantage of these IPP related economic opportunities. So Sarah, I'll pass over the procurement opportunity checklist for you, and then we'll be off for lunch.
Yeah, so this is really kind of building again on everything, the hacks and tips and tricks that we mentioned through technical writing, specifically that checklist. You want to, it just gives you a chance just to look through everything and make sure that your feet are pointed in the right direction. So we talk about identifying opportunities. There's several activities an Indigenous community or business can take to identify and pursue IPP related opportunities. So before, like I mentioned before the tendering process has even begun, it's possible to get advance notice of potential or planned procurement in several ways. So really creating and nurturing a network is an excellent way to learn about upcoming procurements before the process has begun. So again, building that bridge well before you need it. Participate in industry trade shows and other conferences. Again, that's a really good way to learn about IPP related procurements, and it's an opportunity to uncover opportunities that might not have IPP requirements. Lobby companies to be placed on their approved vendor list and to pre-qualify for specific services or projects. And once the procurement process has begun, the Government of Canada, including PSPC and DCC, they issue tender documents on Canada Buys and Mercs, and the tender documents normally specify if an IPP is required. These sites should be monitored on a weekly basis. In a perfect world, that will happen. Canada Buys also has a feature called Partner with Another Business, and this allows the community or business to express an interest in the procurement and invite other businesses to partner with them. The tendering process for major projects requiring an IPP will also include a supplier day. And this is where federal contracting authorities and the procurement partners will present information about the project and answer questions. And there is a real opportunity for leadership and community engagement. So once that opportunity has been identified, or even before, it's time to engage leadership. And if they approve pursuit of the opportunity, then your community or community-owned business. So again, it's all about making those connections and really being aware of what's happening around you, not just tomorrow or next month, but looking at that bigger picture in the future. So that I'll leave it open for John and Ryland to close it if they want to. I don't really think we have time for questions, and we've been answering them as they've gone on.